The first time I noticed my boss, Daniel Hayes, I understood why nearly everyone at the firm admired him. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that seemed effortless, a quiet authority that made even his harshest critiques sound like guidance instead of reprimands. He was in his mid-30s, polished yet approachable, always quick with a reassuring smile in front of clients. For me, though, admiration ran deeper, lingering in a space I rarely allowed myself to acknowledge. Daniel wasn't just my boss, he was the man whose presence made the air around me feel charged. I kept those feelings locked away, disguising them as respect. Daniel was married, his wife Amanda often mentioned in conversations around the office, usually in glowing terms. Together, they were the image of stability, attractive, successful, enviable. That image made my private longing feel reckless, a fantasy that had no place in the tidy structure of my professional life. Still, every time his hand brushed past mine when handing over a document, every time his gaze lingered a beat too long during a meeting, I wondered if the barrier between us was as impenetrable as it seemed. Then I would remind myself of reality. He was my employer, a married man, and my role was to keep everything strictly professional. On the night that changed everything, the office had organized a small celebration for closing a demanding deal. It wasn't extravagant, just a gathering at a local lounge with a handful of drinks and laughter. By midnight, most of the staff had already left, claiming early mornings and tired spouses. I stayed behind, nursing a single glass of wine, and watching Daniel accept drink after drink from colleagues eager to impress him. By the time the bar had thinned out, Daniel was no longer the composed leader I knew from work. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, and his normally sharp eyes had softened into a glaze. He laughed too easily, leaned too heavily on the counter, and when the bartender announced last call, he groaned like a child being told recess was over. I approached him cautiously. "Daniel, maybe we should get you home," I suggested, keeping my tone light. He looked at me, blinking as though trying to focus. "Home," he repeated, the words slurring. "Yeah, that's probably smart." He reached for his phone, then frowned when it slipped from his hand. "I don't think I should drive." "No, you definitely shouldn't," I said, picking up the phone before it hit the floor. My heart thumped harder than it should have. "Come on, I'll get you there." He gave me a lopsided grin, something boyish and strangely vulnerable. "You're a good man, you know that?" The words sent a flicker of warmth through me, though I tried not to show it. I reminded myself that drunk compliments meant little. Still, I couldn't help the tiny surge of satisfaction at being singled out. Helping Daniel outside was awkward at first. He was taller than me, his weight leaning heavily against my shoulder, but he clung with surprising trust. The night air was cool, brushing against the heat of his body pressed mine. For a brief, dizzy moment, I let myself imagine what it would feel like if this closeness wasn't an accident born of alcohol, but a choice. I guided him into my car, buckled his seatbelt, and started the engine. The streets were quiet, slick with the reflection of streetlights. Daniel muttered beside me, half-formed thoughts tumbling from his lips. "Amanda's away this week, visiting her sister. I didn't want to go." He exhaled sharply, almost like a sigh. "Sometimes I feel so alone." The word startled me. Alone? Daniel Hayes, with his perfect marriage and enviable life? I glanced at him quickly, but his eyes were shut, his head tilted against the window. Maybe it was nothing more than a drunk man's rambling, but the admission pulsed in my chest like a secret meant only for me. By the time we reached his neighborhood, my thoughts were a tangle of guilt and anticipation. I reminded myself I was doing the right thing, making sure he got home safe. That was all, nothing more. Still, when I pulled into his driveway and cut the engine, I lingered, staring at the darkened house and listening to the quiet hum of his breathing. Helping him inside, I felt his arm tighten briefly around my shoulder, his weight more deliberate now than clumsy. We crossed the threshold together, the silence of the empty house wrapping around us. Something about it felt heavier than I expected, like stepping into a space where boundaries could blur. Daniel's voice broke the stillness, soft but startling in the hush of the entryway. "You didn't have to do this, but I'm glad you did." I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of just how dangerous this night might become. Daniel leaned heavily on me as I guided him deeper into the house. The place was dark, silent, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and expensive cologne. I kicked off my shoes quietly, unsure why I felt like an intruder in a space I had no right to enter. Every step echoed like a warning. "Living room," he murmured, pointing vaguely. His voice was thick, languid. I eased him onto the sofa, careful not to let him stumble. He sat with a long exhale, running his hands over his face. Even in his disheveled state, Daniel carried an elegance I couldn't ignore. His shirt clung to him, creased from the night, his collar loosened just enough to expose the hollow of his throat. I looked away quickly, scolding myself for noticing. "I'll get you some water," I offered, needing the distraction. In the kitchen, I filled a glass and tried to slow my heartbeat. He was drunk, vulnerable, married. I repeated the words like a mantra, hoping they would drown out the pull I felt. When I returned, he accepted the glass with a faint smile, his fingers brushing mine. The contact lasted an instant, but it lingered like fire against my skin. "You're always steady," Daniel said, taking a sip. "Everyone else wants something from me. But you," his words trailed, his eyes locking onto mine. "You just show up." I swallowed, throat dry. "That's what colleagues do." He chuckled softly, the sound low and unguarded. "Colleagues, right?" For a while, the silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of his breathing. I sat beside him, perhaps too close, but I told myself it was convenience, ready to catch him if he swayed. My rationalizations felt flimsy, yet I clung to them. Daniel set the glass down and leaned back, head resting against the couch. "Marriage isn't always what people think," he said suddenly. His tone was flat, almost resigned. "Everyone sees the photos, the dinners, the hand-holding, but behind closed doors, it's different." I hesitated, unsure if I should respond. "Different how?" He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting mine. The vulnerability in his eyes was disarming, a rare fracture in the armor he wore daily. "Lonely," he whispered. "Amanda's gone so often, and when she's here, it feels like we're strangers sharing a roof." The confession stunned me. I had imagined his marriage as untouchable, a fortress of perfection. Yet here he was, dismantling that illusion with a single word. "Lonely." I wanted to comfort him, to bridge that gap with something more than sympathy. But I knew the danger of stepping too close to the edge. Still, when his hand found mine on the cushion, I didn't move. "Daniel," my voice was unsteady. His fingers tightened slightly, an unspoken plea. "Stay a while," he said. The air between us thickened, heavy with things neither of us dared articulate. I should have stood up, excused myself, left him to sleep off the alcohol. Instead, I stayed, rooted, trapped in the gravity of his presence. He shifted closer, his shoulder brushing mine. The warmth of his body seeped through my shirt, and my breath hitched. When he turned his face toward me, the distance between us narrowed to inches. His lips parted, uncertain, but his eyes burned with clarity I hadn't expected from a drunk man. Before I could think, his mouth pressed against mine. The kiss was clumsy, flavored with whiskey, but it carried a desperation that struck me deep. Shock pinned me in place, every instinct warring inside me. This was wrong. He was my boss, a married man. And yet, the way he kissed me felt like something long buried, clawing its way to the surface. I broke the kiss, breathless. "We can't," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. Daniel's hand cupped the side of my face. "Steady now." "Maybe we shouldn't," he said softly, "but right now I don't care." The words unraveled me. All the boundaries I had carefully built collapsed in that instant. When he kissed me again, I didn't resist. This time it was deeper, surer, pulling me into a storm I had no strength or desire to fight. The night unfolded in fragments of closeness. His head resting against my shoulder, laughter that cracked into silence, touches that grew bolder with each passing moment. What began as care turned into something dangerous, intimate, undeniable. Hours blurred until exhaustion pulled us down. We ended up lying side by side, his hand clasping mine like a secret promise. I stared into the darkness, my chest tight, with equal parts exhilaration and dread. What did we just do? I whispered to the ceiling, though no answer came. The only sound was Daniel's steady breathing, the kind of peace that follows a storm. And yet, I knew the real storm hadn't even begun. Sunlight spilled into the living room, sharp and unforgiving, dragging me out of the fragile cocoon of the night before. My body was stiff from sleeping on the couch, but it wasn't discomfort that jolted me awake. It was the weight of Daniel's hand still entwined with mine. For a fleeting second, I allowed myself the illusion that it was natural, that waking beside him was something I could get used to. Then reality struck, heavy and merciless. I slid my hand free, sitting up slowly. Daniel stirred, groaning faintly as his eyes blinked open. For a moment, his face carried confusion, as though he were piecing together fragments of a dream. Then recognition set in, followed by silence thick enough to suffocate. "Morning," I said, my voice hoarse. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat up, resting his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. "Tell me, this didn't happen," he muttered, though the way he refused to meet my eyes told me he knew it had. "It did," I admitted quietly. The words felt like a betrayal spoken aloud. Daniel exhaled long and heavy. "God, what have I done?" His voice cracked on the last word. I wanted to tell him it wasn't just his doing, that I hadn't resisted, that part of me had longed for this moment. But guilt coiled inside me, making it impossible to find the right words. Instead, I asked the question that burned in my chest. "Do you regret it?" He finally looked at me, his expression torn. "I regret what it means," he said carefully. "But not you." The answer was both a bomb and a blade. My heart surged with dangerous hope, but my mind reminded me of the truth. He was married, bound to someone else. Last night had been a breach, not a beginning. We sat in silence, the morning light exposing everything we'd tried to hide in the dark. I thought of Amanda. Her name alone felt like an accusation. She trusted him, believed in the image of a devoted husband, while I had been complicit in tearing that trust apart. Was it just the alcohol? I asked finally. My voice trembled despite my attempt at steadiness. Or was it something you wanted? Daniel hesitated. His silence stretched, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, he said, "Maybe both. Maybe I've been ignoring something inside me for too long." The admission made my chest tighten. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was honest, raw. Still, honesty didn't erase consequences. He stood, raking a hand through his hair, pacing the room like a man trapped in a cage. "This can't get out. If Amanda ever knew, if anyone at work knew," he trailed off, shaking his head, "it would destroy everything." The words cut deeper than I expected. What we shared wasn't a secret romance. It was a mistake that needed burying. I knew he was right, but the ache in my chest grew unbearable. "So, what happens now?" I asked, though I already feared the answer. Daniel stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes heavy with conflict. "We go back to normal. We forget this ever happened." Normal. The word tasted bitter. There was no returning to the way things were. The line had been crossed, and no amount of pretending could redraw it. Still, I nodded, because what else was there to do? I gathered my things quietly, every movement feeling final. At the door, I hesitated. Part of me wanted him to stop me, to say something, anything, that would make last night mean more than a reckless lapse. But he stayed silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts a storm of longing and remorse. I knew I would walk into the office on Monday and face him across the boardroom table as though nothing had changed. But everything had. That night replayed in my mind like a wound that wouldn't heal. The kiss, the confessions, the way he had held my hand as though it meant something. And maybe it did. Maybe it meant everything. But meaning and possibility were two different things. Infidelity is never clean. It leaves behind ghosts that cling to the heart, haunting even the quietest moments. I had touched a part of Daniel Hayes no one else had seen, but it was a part one could never claim. In the end, I wasn't sure what hurt more, the guilt of betrayal or the knowledge that for one night I had tasted the very thing I could never truly have. The following Monday, the office felt colder than usual. Perhaps it was the air conditioning, or perhaps it was me, burdened with the weight of secrets too heavy for ordinary routines. My desk looked the same, the chatter of colleagues sounded the same, but nothing was the same. I had crossed a line with Daniel Hayes, and no amount of spreadsheets or polite greetings could erase that. When Daniel walked in, he was dressed as impeccably as ever. Navy suit, polished shoes, expression firm. To anyone else, he looked unchanged. But to me, every detail seemed different. His eyes avoided mine too deliberately. His voice, when addressing me, carried a stiffness I hadn't noticed before. It was subtle, the kind of performance only someone with something to hide could deliver. Our first meeting of the day was agony. Sitting across the conference table, I felt his gaze flicker toward me only once, quickly withdrawn as if the memory of our shared night might be visible to everyone else in the room. I stared at my notes, willing myself into invisibility, even as my pulse hammered with the recollection of his lips on mine. During the break, I escaped to the corridor, needing air. That's when I felt his presence beside me. Daniel didn't speak at first, merely stood close enough for the tension to throb between us. Finally, in a low voice, he said, "We need to keep everything normal. No one can know." I nodded, though my chest tightened. "I understand." His eyes softened for a fraction of a second, a fleeting break in his facade, before he walked away, leaving me rooted to the floor. The conversation was brief, but it echoed louder than any declaration. What we had shared existed only in the shadows, a forbidden truth to be buried beneath professional masks. Days turned into weeks, and though we never spoke of it again directly, the unspoken lingered. There were moments, passing papers during a meeting, standing side by side at the printer, where our hands almost touched and the air between us charged with everything unsaid. Each time, Daniel would pull back first, retreating into the safety of distance. Then Amanda appeared. She stopped by the office one Friday afternoon, radiant in a way that made my stomach twist. She greeted me warmly, her smile open and kind, utterly unaware of the betrayal etched between her husband and me. Watching her hand slip into Daniel's as she spoke to the staff made me feel like an intruder in a life I had no right to disrupt. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't silence the questions. Had Daniel meant what he confessed about loneliness, or had it been the alcohol? Was I just a convenient escape from the cracks in his marriage? Or was there something more he was too afraid to admit in the daylight? The uncertainty consumed me. At work, I found myself searching for clues in his every expression. Sometimes I caught him watching me, his gaze soft, almost wistful, before he turned away. Other times he was distant, detached, burying himself in endless calls and emails. The inconsistency was maddening, leaving me suspended between hope and despair. One evening, after most employees had gone, I lingered by my desk, unable to leave. Daniel emerged from his office, startled to see me still there. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the silence. "You should go home," he said, finally, his tone gentle. "I will," I replied, though I didn't move. The words I wanted to say pressed against my lips. "Do you think about me? Do you regret me? Do you want this to happen again?" But I swallowed them, afraid of what his answers might destroy. Instead, I gathered my things and walked past him. As I brushed by, his hand shifted slightly, almost as if he wanted to reach for me, then stopped. The hesitation burned more than rejection. That night, as I drove home through the empty streets, one truth became clear. What had happened between Daniel and me was not over. It lingered like a spark hidden in dry grass, waiting for the smallest breath of wind to ignite into flames. And deep down, I feared that neither of us would resist when it did.